So today, we're doing something a little bit different with a very, very old story. Instead of getting bogged down in theology or arguing over beliefs, we're going to treat the Exodus like a historical cold case. We're just going to dig in and see exactly what the dirt and the ancient Egyptian papyri have to say about one of history's biggest, most famous claims.
Right, let's dive into this. I think it's totally fair to ask, what actually happens when we strip away all those Hollywood movies, the epic soundtracks, all that classic Charlton Heston imagery, and just look at the hard physical evidence left in the ground? Well, the reality is actually a lot more grounded and, honestly, in a lot of ways, way more fascinating than the myths.
To keep our investigation on track here, let's look at the Bronze Age timeline real quick. Around 1900 BC, changing climates brought these massive waves of Asiatic migrants down into the Egyptian delta. By 1550 BC, a huge political shift gets them expelled, and then right around 1250 BC, we hit the reign of Ramesses II, which, for our cold case, is absolutely the sweet spot. Now, check out the term Hyksos. It literally translates from Egyptian as rulers of foreign lands. These early Canaanite migrants didn't just quietly settle in the delta and keep to themselves. They eventually took over. They set up a whole ruling class that brought Levantine culture, architecture, and even military tech right to the banks of the Nile. And they weren't just some small, isolated band of nomads either. Excavations at a delta city called Avaris revealed a massive urban footprint of up to 30,000 Asiatic residents. I mean, we're talking about a sprawling, densely populated city. This completely proves a huge demographic presence of Semitic people living exactly where the ancient text says they were. Okay, so as the native Egyptians eventually pushed back against these foreigners, we get to this absolutely crucial quote. This is from an ancient administrative text called Papyrus Anastasi III. It explicitly demands that laborers produce their daily brick tally, and get this, they can't lessen the amount even though the straw they need is lacking. I mean, this is basically a literal receipt. It perfectly matches the ancient claims of intense forced labor quotas, mud brick manufacturing, and that very specific, kind of brutal punishment of withholding straw. And it gets better, because the source text explicitly names Pi-Ramesses as one of the storage cities built by these laborers. The crazy thing here archaeologically is that Pi-Ramesses was literally lost to history. It was this massive capital that had to be completely abandoned around 1060 BC simply because the branch of the Nile it sat on silted up. So naming a city that basically vanished under the sand centuries later, that tells us this historical memory is incredibly old and totally authentic. When we look at the central figure of this whole escape, you might naturally assume the name Moses is, a traditional Hebrew invention. Actually, scratch that, it's not at all. The name is an authentic Egyptian loanword. The root M-O-S-E-Y, or Mose, literally just means born of or child. You see it all the time in royal Egyptian names. Think that Mose or Ramesses. It perfectly fits the profile of someone raised right inside the Egyptian royal nursery, exactly as the narrative claims. And when it comes to the plagues, geoarchaeologists point to this fascinating concept called the ecological cascade theory. So instead of random, chaotic magic, the plagues actually follow a highly logical, biological chain reaction. Basically, a toxic red algal bloom in the Nile kills the fish, which drives the frogs ashore. The frogs die off, causing insect swarms to just absolutely thrive in the carcasses, which then naturally leads to the spread of livestock and human disease. It reads exactly like a localized ecological collapse. First things first, we really need to clear up a massive historical translation error here. We almost always hear that they crossed the Red Sea, right? Which obviously implies a deep, massive ocean gulf. But the original Hebrew text actually says Yam Suf, which translates to the Sea of Reeds. That is a huge difference. It aligns the escape route with the shallow, marshy lakes of the Isthmus of Suez, which forms the natural aquatic border of ancient Egypt. And knowing they were at a shallow lagoon instead of a deep ocean makes a world of difference, all because of a physical phenomenon called wind set-down. Hydrodynamic modeling done by atmospheric physicists has shown that a sustained 63-mile-per-hour east wind can physically push shallow coastal water back. This exposes a temporary land bridge for a few hours before the water rapidly rushes back in. It's a completely natural phenomenon that fits the geographic description in the text to a T. So once they're actually out of Egypt, we run into what we call the demographics problem. The traditional translation suggests like 2 million people were wandering around the Sinai desert. That is a logistical nightmare. The environment there just cannot support that many people. But linguists have pointed out that the Hebrew word elef, which is traditionally translated as thousand, concurrently meant clan or military unit. If you translate it as clan, the population drops to roughly 20,000 to 40,000 people. That brings it right down to a realistic, manageable size for a nomadic group in that harsh environment. But even with a much smaller group, people always ask, well, why don't we find massive campsites in the Sinai dirt? Geoarchaeologists call this the architectural bias. Complex nomadic societies use tents. They don't use stone. They simply don't leave permanent destruction layers or heavy foundations behind. You can literally have thousands of nomads living in an area for years, and they will leave virtually zero archaeological footprint for us to dig up 3 millennia later. Another really big question is, why isn't there a drowned pharaoh mentioned anywhere in the Egyptian records? That all comes down to how ancient states operated. We call it the propaganda rule. Egyptian royal monuments weren't history books. They existed to preserve cosmic order or Mot. Because of this, they purposefully never recorded military defeats, internal disasters, or successful slave escapes. The lack of an Egyptian monument talking about a mass escape isn't proof it didn't happen. It's just standard, run-of-the-mill, ancient political spin. Jumping ahead to the end of the Late Bronze Age, we get this massive physical receipt. The Merneptah Stele, which was carved around 1208 BC, documents an Egyptian military campaign in the Levant. It bluntly states, Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. Now, despite the classic ancient bragging, this definitively proves that by the late 13th century BC, the Egyptian state recognized a specific group called Israel, actively living in Canaan. But you really have to look closely at the language here. The scribe writing the Merneptah Stele used a very specific hieroglyphic determinative when writing the word Israel. They didn't use the symbol for a settled city-state, which they used for established places like Ashkelon. Instead, they used this specific symbol for a foreign people. This linguistic precision is huge. It proves Israel was viewed by Egypt as a distinct, semi-nomadic, socio-ethnic group rather than an established kingdom. And the archaeology backs this up perfectly. Right around 1200 BC, there was a sudden explosion of unwalled settlements up in the Canaanite highlands. The material culture of these new kids on the block tells a super specific story. They built 4-room houses that were identical to the ones back at Avaris. They distinctly avoided eating pork, and their early vocabulary has 27 specific Egyptian loanwords deeply embedded in it. This sudden archaeological explosion ties directly back to a New Kingdom Egyptian origin. So let's pull all this together and close out this cold case. The claims of a large Semitic population and forced mud brick labor, we have the dirt at Avaris and the actual papyrus receipts to prove it. The escaped geography perfectly matches the marshy borders of Egypt. Now, we can't physically verify the wilderness years because, as we learned, nomads are basically archaeologically invisible. But the arrival of a distinct Israelite group in Canaan is definitively demonstrated by Egyptian monuments. So while some elements definitely remain a mystery, the core socioeconomic and geographical framework here is incredibly solid. Which leaves us with this final thought. We always hear that phrase, history is written by the victors. But maybe the real story, the grounded, actual history of a people, survives in the quiet, everyday details. In the exact quotas for mud bricks, the specific layout of a 4-room house, and the borrowed words carried out of the desert. It definitely makes you look at the dirt a little differently, doesn't it?
What the Fact? Follow for more.